Okay, for the next video I'm going to look at the pivot mount. Now the pivot mount is used on the tricopters for the rear arm, on the avatars for the two front arms, and it's the same mount you use for the gimbals. Okay, so I've already covered fitting the motor and stuff in another video, but I'm just going to look at, I'm going to pop that, actually what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take that motor out off, just for the sake of making the rest of this a little bit easier to watch. Alright, there's my S-bend in the cable that I covered earlier, just to neaten up the wiring. So what I've got here is a boom, and on the boom I have fitted the two ball bearing races that are supplied with it. Now, getting these two bearings in the right spot and getting them physically into place can be tricky. Sometimes what you need to do is just give this a light sanding so that they move a little easier. You can see these ones are basically nearly impossible to move. On the carbons booms, they're really tricky to fit, but what you need to do is just give it enough of a light sand with, say, 600 grit paper, just to give it enough movement. You don't want to go too tight. Now, the end bearing is really easy to fit because you get supplied this locking ring, this end ring, and that goes over the end, and I like to have it nice and, actually I'll turn around, that's one I've grunged up previously. I like to have it so that the metal sits just inside of the end of the flange, so you don't have a sharp edge poking beyond this ring. Okay, so sighting that bearing is actually quite easy because it wants to sit hard up against the sleeve, and the sleeve wants to just be about 1/2 mil beyond the end of the boom. Okay, so that one's easy. The inner one is a little trickier to sight. Basically what you want to do is have it far enough along the boom, obviously to fit over the block. But this is actually wrong. And it might be a bit hard to see, but if you look in there, the insides of the bearings are actually touching that inner surface just there of the boom. Right? They're actually touching. And what that means is that that inner race of the bearing will actually rub on that, and that is really right now almost impossible to pivot. It's sitting in there, it looks okay, but it actually is nearly impossible to turn. Right? It's really tight. If you look at the instructions, say you want 1/2 millimeter gap between this bearing and this face, and another 1/2 millimeter gap between that face and that bearing. So this bearing needs to move that way to give that gap. What I do is, rather than try and look at what that gap is in there, because by the time you put that over the other half of the block, you can't actually see that gap. What I do is I work on this face of the bearing. What I try and do is, if we can get the angle just right, you'll see that the bearing right now, a bit hard to see, is actually inside that surface. There's a ridge there, right? What I try and do is make sure that surface of the bearing and this surface of the block are flat with each other. And if you've got that at both ends, so the bearing is flush with the surface of the block, you have your inner gap right. So at the moment, those bearings aren't right. So how do I get that bearing further on? Well, there's lots of really interesting scientific methods, but I like to use a hammer, but I use it gently. Alright, you may use a mallet, but with the block physically holding the bearings, if you just tap the flanges of the block a little, that will very happily move that bearing along. Now, just that one gentle little tap has produced that free play I needed. Right, you can see there is now a gap between the bearing and the block and the bearing. And if we look there and line that up nice and neat, and look there and line that up nice and neat, right, that's all going to sit very nicely. Now, as I mentioned in the motor video, you want to make sure you place, and I've gone and lost it, the control arm on the boom before you fit the motor. In the case of the gimbal mount, you need to actually fit that onto the boom, this arm onto the boom, before you even put the bearings on, because you can't slide it on from the other end. But just make sure that thing is physically on the boom before you go and put bearings or motor mounts or anything like that on it. Otherwise, you'll get a belt and that won't be there. Now, little tip, trick, thing that does sort of get skimped over in the instructions and does mess a few guys up. If you're using the long legs on a tricopter, they sort of sit, they get mounted so they sit either side, so I can find its matching pair, yep, either side of the rear block. So the legs sit either side of the boom, okay? If you do that, you've got a bit of a problem with these legs. And that is that this comes shipped with two arms on it, right? The bottom arm, once this is in place, will actually sit in between those two legs. And so when this tries to pivot, it'll actually hit them. On an Avatar, that will hit the top plate. So what you need to do for an Avatar or a tricopter, and I tend to do it on the gimbal mount if I'm not going to need the other arm, is actually cut the arm off. You can see the shiny bit of metal still there from where I have cut the other arm off. Okay, and that will end up being the bottom side of that bracket, which will sit in between the legs at the back. So make sure you hack off, I just use a Dremel blade, and just grind off one of those arms. Okay, so we can now do this part of the physical assembly, which is to set the bearing in there. Now I've got plenty of free play, but when it's in the right spot, the outside of the bearing lines up nicely with the outside of that. So at this point in time, I will put the inner ring on. I will take my two grub screws supplied for it, and using my 1.5mm hex driver, I will just snug up opposing grub screws. And remember, these are metal screws going into metal, so I must use Loctite. Now you don't want to over tighten these or you will warp the inside of the sheath. That pops into place, and my other block goes over the top, and I just make sure that that face of the bearing is sitting flush with this. Now I don't put the grub screws into this arm at all at this point. I leave them out until actually the build's done. Because what that then lets me do is, when this is built, I want to make sure that when the motor is mounted on the end of the boom, that the motor shaft lines up perfectly with that centre pin. So I leave those grub screws out until it's all completely assembled, and that actually is my yaw fine tuning. I actually use those two grub screws that go through the control arm here. I use those to set my yaw centre. So when I'm doing effectively yaw trim, I do it via those two grub screws. Okay, so I leave them out at this point in time. The next thing we need to do for this is to mount up the servo plate, which screws onto these. Again, I'm going to leave that off for now because I don't screw them on until this is all assembled, because this block will move a bit and be compressed a bit as we screw the frame together. So I leave the servo block off until basically I've got the top plate in place. Okay, and we'll come back and we'll have a look. Now we'll come back and have a look at that assembled on another airframe. So here's a completed pivot mount on another tricopter. happen to have lying around, not. And you can see the carbon plate just screws on to, using M3 screws, onto the end of those brackets on the side of the pivot bolt. I believe now the servo even actually comes pre-attached to the carbon plate. You need to add your ball joints to the two spots. I'll show you that way around so you can get a better view. But basically we've got the ball joint coming off the front of the control arm there, and the other ball joint comes off the back of the servo arm, and you need to set up that gap between the ball joints as per the manual, and that clips on. So the idea is that when this arm is pointing straight up, and you use your servo tester to actually set the servo to center point to set that arm in the right spot. So with that arm pointing straight up, this arm should be pointing straight up, and with those two lined up nicely, the motor itself should also be straight up on the tricopter. Alright, with the gimbal it's a little less fussy. Right, because you've got your camera mount, but again what I do is I build the frame, I set it flat on a bench, and with those grub screws either side of the control arm I have them loose, and I line the gimbal up until it looks square with the frame, and then I will nip those two grub screws in the pivot arm into place to actually set, if you like, level for the gimbal, or zero for the gimbal. Okay, so I use those two grub screws, the two that go in either side of this control arm, as my fine tuning of getting the motor or the gimbal nice and flat. And once I've got that done, those two grub screws get nipped up. Again, don't forget your Loctite, and that's the pivot arm done.